Hi. So this week we have one of our own faculty members. Aisha has been teaching ceramics at Evergreen since 2011. She also has a studio that she works from in Olympia. She works with bare brown clay and most recently salt to examine the experience of one's own power and privilege derived from their race, class, and gender identities, as well as the effect it has on others in the figure's vicinity. Aisha received a BA from Grinnell College, a BFA from WSU, and an MFA from the University of Nebraska Lincoln. She is the recipient of several fellowships and awards. Most recently, she was the artist in resident at Baltimore Clayworks as a part of the Lormina Salter Fellowship. The situations that Aisha's figures endure in their presentations often encounter this aha or nearly aha moment, which produces a kind of visual lyricism. The viewer might ask, on what plane do these figures find themselves on where examination becomes powerful enough to satisfy a tendency to interpret? One piece in particular entitled Dissolve, in which one man appears to be nearly drowning in a snowsuit made of salt, encounters, we can only assume he's been wandering, a naked woman crouching with a pitcher. A brushstroke of gloss inside, water, invokes completeness and satisfies an otherwise apparent anxiety. While noticing the obvious differences between the two of them, they examine themselves to find solution. So, let's welcome Aisha.
Thank you. Hello, hello, hello. Yes, no? No, yeah, oh. Wow. Okay, I'm a cyborg today. It's kind of interesting. I've never worn one of these things before. It's kind of weird. Okay, hi everybody. So my name is Aisha Harrison, and everybody's already said about everything, so I don't need to say much. No, I'm going to talk about some influences that I've had, some inspirations, but mostly I'm going to talk about how my thinking has changed and developed about my own privilege, other people's privilege, white privilege, and identity. So I'm going to start a little bit kind of like where I came from, which is here. Olympia, Washington, my hometown. I love it here. It's a small town, as you all know, but we have the Puget Sound. We have lots of places to go outside, to be in nature, and I really feel like that's a major influence on me, even if it's not so apparent in my work. But the one thing that I think probably is apparent is that I grew up in a place that was pretty majority white, I would say. And so while that's not necessarily pictured here, that is one thing that you'll probably see throughout my work a little bit. And then these are my lovely parents, my mom Laisha, my dad Harry, and so they plus that equals me, right? That's me a couple of years ago. I look a little different now. So my parents got divorced when I was pretty young, 7. And I spent about half the time with either parent. And so that meant lots of individual time, which I feel very fortunate to have had. And I always thought about how I looked so much like them both. Looking in my family trees, like how I looked so much like my cousins on both sides. And I thought, how is that possible that I could be from a white mom and a black dad and somehow still look like both sides of my family so intensely? And so there's this, being a multiracial person or biracial person, I thought about that a lot and my identity. And then I also thought about history, and there's this kind of tension. I'm sure most of you know about it. This tension between people of color and white people, maybe, yeah. So I'm just going to talk about that. So I'm going to be pretty in your face about it. We can talk about it afterwards. But so there's this recent history of colonialism and slavery. It goes back pretty far. And there's this binary way of thinking of black and white. And when I was a kid, and still now, although less now, I got asked a lot, what are you? And that question is pretty challenging for somebody like me. And maybe other people don't get asked, what are you? So people were trying to figure out basically what my heritage was or something like that. And so I always struggled with the answer to that question, what are you? And so I ended up being kind of angry about that question, which is understandable, because the implication within that question is you're not somebody I can put in a box. You don't look like me, and you don't look like them, and I don't know where to put you. And so you kind of just don't fit in anywhere. And so I would spit back, well, what do you think? You know, how about you guess? And so they would guess lots of things, none of which were ever black, never. And so that really kind of made me feel strange that they would not suggest that I was black. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. The basic idea, though, is that this question, what are you, basically highlights that I am not like that person who's asking me. And as a person who felt like I was both, having a white person ask me that question was pretty jarring, I would say. And so when I started making artwork, I felt like I wanted to make work about situations that I was in. I wanted to make work that was personal. I wasn't really interested in sort of this work about, I don't know, other things that I don't really know very much about. I feel like I know the most about my own experience. And so I thought maybe I would make work about my identity. And so I thought, well, what would work about my identity look like? So I'm giving you the journey, okay? This is like the long vision journey. What would it look like? And so the next couple slides I'm going to show you are sort of tools that I use in my work now and in the past work to try to figure out how I might translate my experiences with my identity and with racism and privilege. So I traveled a lot as a kid and as a young adult. So this is when I was in, I actually took that picture. That's why it's so blurry. This is when I was in Japan. I went there. This is my mom and dad, and my mom was an exchange professor there through Evergreen. And then I went to Spain when I was in high school. I went to Spain as an exchange student, and I stayed with a host family, and they had 3 kids. So those were some of my early travel experiences. And from traveling, I learned a lot about watching and waiting to engage. So I would sort of sit back on the sidelines and watch and figure out how I could maneuver myself to fit into that situation. And I think actually I had been practicing that my whole life, actually, because living in a place where there weren't very many people who were mixed or even people of color, I felt like I needed to figure out avenues to fit in as much as possible. And so I think I did that from early on in my schooling career and just high school, just trying to fit in, however. And I think everybody tries to fit in to some degree, but I was trying to fit in racially, and that felt really hard. The other thing I observed a lot when I was traveling is power dynamics. I would watch and see who had the power in situations so that I could figure out where I was supposed to go. Another tool that I use is the sort of mixed, not mixed messages, but trying to incorporate 2 messages at the same time. And I went to Grinnell College in Iowa, as Taff mentioned, and I majored in Spanish and Latin American literature. And there, this is an image from the conquest time during, and so the Christians came and they were trying to convert the indigenous people to Christianity. And so the indigenous people made images like this that were using both Christian imagery, so that's supposed to be Jesus there in the center, Jesus' face, but also their own, and the cross. But the cross was in both of their religions, and so to use the cross was like a way of using both. And then the symbols on the cross, and then the sort of flames going out the side. That those were indigenous symbols, and the square on top. So it's this interesting way of connecting these two things. And the Christians would read this as, oh, we're converting those indigenous people. And yeah, there's a couple things on there, but really, we're converting those indigenous folks to a Christianity. And the indigenous people saw it as both. They could see that there was Christian imagery, but they could also understand that, of course, that their indigenous ideas were still there, still present. So kind of like this work, this image, my work can be read differently by people with different backgrounds. And I also try to incorporate more than one perspective. And I feel like I can do that partially because I am mixed. Another tool that I use is magical realism. And again, this comes from my work at Grinnell College and with Latin American literature. I have images here because those are the things that really stuck in my brain because I'm a visual person. So magical realism is kind of about using people and objects grounded in this reality, but incorporating magical or symbolic elements also. So in this image, Frida Kahlo is dressed in her she is also mixed. She was mixed. So she's using not only this magical realism piece, which is the hearts and this little vein that's being clipped off there, and the picture of Diego Rivera, which is in that hand over there. So she's talking about identity, that she's in this, this is the colonial dress, and then that is her sort of indigenous dress. And so she's combining both identity and magical realism in one image. And I was really interested in, I was really interested in that as well. Oh dear, what am I doing? Okay, I'll be a little bit less. Okay. So she was very influential in my work. And then this image, I love this image. It's like makes my heart beat. This is another image, I think, of using magical realism. This is of a priest named Kura. And there's 6 Buddhas on a little thing coming out of Kura's mouth for the 6-syllable prayer that he chanted while he walked around spreading Buddhism. So I just think I love that there's this real person, a real thing. And he's actually done very realistically, but then there's this otherworldly part or inexplicable part that is the image also. I'm visually influenced by these two artists. I actually don't know the name of this artist. This is one of those unknown artists, but I love both of these images because they're specific people rather than kind of a universal person. I think maybe most of you guys know like the universal woman image, which I think I don't really believe in universal. So I might say that again in quotation marks. And I also love that both these images speak to this kind of humanness. They're not perfectly symmetrical. Like her nose is just a tiny bit not, and I just love those little things that I can really connect to when I see a sculpture of a person that's real, a real person. And another tool I use is narrative. So this is Arthur Gonzalez's work. He's a sculptor out of California. And I just love the way he combines materials, but also how he's using narrative. Okay, so I went to school at Grinnell. I got a degree in Spanish, and then I taught school for a couple of years in Atlanta. And while I was there, I was doing some ceramics, so I hadn't even touched clay barely at this point. And I was teaching 3rd and 4th grade, and I was doing ceramics on the side, and I just got to love it more than anything else. I didn't want to do anything else. And so I decided to go back to school and get a BFA, because I thought I could really only go get an MFA if I had a BFA. And I really wanted to gift myself the time to develop my work. And so I did go back to Washington State University over in Pullman, and these are some of the images I made there. These aren't specifically about race or privilege yet. So I'm kind of like learning what I want to make work about still when I'm in undergrad here. So that's one. Here's a couple more from that time. When I got out, I moved back to Olympia, and I had very small studio space and no kiln. And so I was sort of relying on other people's kilns. And I did fire at a local person's house, and that worked out. But I was still kind of making work about everyday stuff, which is still what I make work about. It's just different everyday stuff. I figured out I wanted to use brown clay, that I wanted it to somehow reference my own body. So until these pieces here, I had been using white clay. And there was something about this brown, spotty clay, I still use this clay now, that I loved. I loved that there was this grittiness to it. The grog, you can actually see it in this image. There are little speckles. Grog is fired clay that's been ground up and put back in the clay body. And so it's like these little speckles of white in this brown clay, and I thought that was particularly good for me. So then after my BFA, I was here for 3 more years, and I worked at Home Depot, and I worked in my studio, and I really wanted to get an MFA. And so I needed to figure out my content a little bit more to apply, because getting into graduate school is pretty difficult in ceramics, especially into the schools that I wanted to go to. And so I figured that my most fertile place I could learn from was my identity. And so I ventured off to graduate school. Some of the things I was looking at, well, I wasn't quite there yet. Some of the things I was looking at is Adrienne Piper. I really admired her because she could parry these uncomfortable situations that I was in all the time. And I loved her work. She appears very Caucasian. She looks very white, but she's not. And so when she's in these situations in restaurants or bars or whatever, and somebody says a racist comment, next to her, she hands them this card. And so it makes them as uncomfortable, hopefully, as they've made her. Right before graduate school, I went to WSW, which is the, I'm forgetting what the name of that is, the Women's Studio Workshop in upstate New York. And I had an opportunity to be a resident there for 5 weeks. And so I made a bunch of heads. These are pretty large heads. And I was just thinking about how I could talk about identity. And hair seemed to be a good place to start for me, because people had always told me I had, well, not people. People of color had always told me I had good hair. And I felt like that was almost the same as asking me, what are you, in a way, because it was like trying to separate me from them, like you have good hair and I don't. And I'm going to talk more about that. So I thought it was because I wasn't black enough. That was where I was at the time. In this work, I was using hair as a sculptural element and working with it as a signifier of it. So I was getting privileges based on how I looked that I didn't realize I was getting, basically. And that you have good hair was drawing attention to that, and that was hard for me. So then I finally got to graduate school and decided I needed to work on expressions. These are just a couple things that I did there at the very, very beginning. And I continued to work with hair as a sculptural actor, thinking of it like it has a mind of its own. And I love hair because it grows out of the head. And so I think maybe it contains like our thoughts, you know? Like the thoughts kind of like go out like this, and the hair kind of like gets them. And also it's kind of like our history, right? Like the hair is like the dead follicle or the dead skin or whatever that's coming out of your head. I don't know, it's just something kind of interesting. It's like the past, it's our past. So it's grown out. It's like our fingernails. They grow out and then we cut them off, right? So I love hair for that reason. And this is another one of those hair taking out the, gathering up the thoughts. And I think that also I feel like hair has this biological connection. So my hair is a combination of my dad's hair and my mom's hair. And so I was thinking about how I felt disconnected from both communities, both the community of color and the white community. I didn't really feel connected to either group. And so this is kind of a way of disconnection, I guess. And I was thinking about being put into a box, having to check a box. This is kind of around the time when the census changed and all that. And so this idea of checking which box I was such a big deal growing up. You know, I would always try to check more than one, or I would say, you know, I'm not either one, or I would say I'm mixed or whatever. And so trying to check one box was always really problematic for me. Then I just like shoved the hair in that box. And here's another piece where the hair actually ends up in a box in the back. It's very rigid in the back, but the front is kind of So I wanted to show kind of the freedom of hair, individuality and personality, but also the societal ideas of what hair, and then, and by extension, what I should be by putting me in this box at the end. So it's really hard to see, but there's a grid on this wall behind her. And there's these little tiny dots. There's black dots and white dots. So I started thinking about, I wanted to problematize the idea of choosing to identify as either white or black, that binary. And so, because I felt like it was sort of, at this time, I was still sort of thinking like, that would mean I would have to choose which parent I loved more. And that just felt like I couldn't do that, because I love them both. And so this piece was kind of like that there was this game I was being asked to play, right, to choose which one I was going to be, and that trying to play this game was just an impossibility, which is why I'm trying to make it as overwhelming as possible. But I realized that it was actually more serious than a game. It was more difficult than a game, and it didn't really have an end like a game. And so I started thinking about what it would mean for me to choose to identify as black. And that was something that felt really unknown to me, to leave behind the whiteness and just identify as black felt really dangerous, actually. I felt like I wasn't going to have this thing that I sort of was clinging to. And so that's what this work is about. So in all these works, I was trying to get at this complexity of how I was identifying. At the time, I was working through all these emotional impacts of privilege. I'm still doing that now. It just has a little bit different look. But I didn't really have the language at this time to talk about these things. And so it was very frustrating in graduate school because I didn't have sort of the background to talk about. I just had my own experiences. And so I could communicate those experiences to my fellow students and teachers, but they didn't really understand what I was talking about because they were all not people of color, except for one. And so that was pretty challenging. But I feel like in some ways it made me grow a lot because I had to get this kind of strength, inward strength, to just power through and make the work even though I couldn't explain it. And so I want to be clear that I'm not making illustrations of these situations that happen to me or that I observe. They're more like getting at some specific part of it and then extracting to make this an emotional piece, that getting to the emotion of what has happened in that one interaction. And these really are very specific interactions that I've witnessed. I want to talk just a little bit more about a couple of more influences. Yoko Ono has been a huge influence on me. I saw this cut piece. I saw it at Penland, which is in North Carolina. It's a great craft school in North Carolina. And this piece is so influential because what happened was, so I'll tell you the piece first, and then what happened to me. And so this person comes up on stage. It was not Yoko Ono. It was somebody who's performing this piece. She comes up on stage and she says, she has a pair of scissors, and she puts them down in front of her, and she says, okay, I would like you to cut off my clothes. I'm going to sit here, and you cut off my clothes. The only rule is you have to come from the front and take the scissors, cut the piece, and then put the scissors back, and the next person can take the scissors. And so I'm sitting there going, I'm looking at her, and in my mind I'm thinking, wow, what piece of her do I want? As I want something. And I know that sounds kind of sick now when I say it out loud, but I think everybody in the whole room thought that. You know, we're like looking at her clothes like, ooh, I love the way that shirt looks. I love the way that little band is around her arm. I want that piece, you know? And as I watched other people start cutting off her clothes, and I watched how when the scissors hit her skin, she would flinch slightly. And I watched how people would get closer and closer to areas of her that were really precious and fragile. And they would get to her bra strap and cut, you know, it just got to be so intense, that little interaction between each person and her. And I knew I couldn't leave. And I knew I had to cut a piece of clothing off of her. I knew that those were the two things that were required of me in that instance. So I was like sobbing, and I was just letting it all come out and watching this interaction happen. And actually, eventually someone handed scissors over her head to someone who came in from behind her. It was horrible. And at the very end, she just kind of got up, and she couldn't stand because her legs had gone to sleep. It was just this it was such a powerful thing to watch. And what I love about that piece, among many things, is that it asks a lot of questions. It doesn't give a lot of answers. It's just really very simple action that opens a giant thing to think about, or to witness, or to experience. So I love that, and I want to try to get that in my work. And another person I really looked at is this Felix Gonzalez Torres person, artist. And so this is, he's responding to the AIDS epidemic. And so these are all little tiny pieces of candy. And he draws out a space where the candy is supposed to be, and he gets the weight of the person who's died in candy. And then he puts it on the floor, all spread out. And then each person who comes to see this exhibition is supposed to take a piece of that candy and eat it, consume it. So it's sort of similar in cut piece in a way. But I loved that the idea that this person would be disappearing. That's what he wants to get at, is that there's this AIDS epidemic and all these people are disappearing, and we're just like taking it and eating the candy and moving right along, you know? I loved also that he was really activating the space and having the viewer sort of be a participant to make the work real, or to make the work happen. There had to be an audience. And so graduate school came to a close, and this is my thesis show. I was really trying to get more at that interaction, and then the mind shift. So in the Yoko Ono thing, I was really curious about how my mind changed from what piece of her can I have, what can I get from her, to extreme empathy. So I want to make my work sort of flow like that, to have that mind transition. So this piece is called Black, White, Brown, and I'm just going to really quickly tell you what it consists of. So there's two figures, except that it's really just one figure that I made whole and then cut in half and hollowed out. And then there's all these panels. They're black on one side, white on the other side, and then the part in the middle is brown. And they have, underneath the layers of black and white paint, there's imagery of people or feelings that I had. So, and then the black and white got put on top. This piece was really interesting because as you walked around it, you had a different experience. So as you walked in the door, there were all the black panels, and you kind of could see between them these two figures looking at each other, or one figure cut in half looking at each other. And as you walked around, your perspective changed from seeing them against black to seeing them against white. And I wanted to say that I was brown, and against white, I didn't fit in, and against black, I didn't fit in. And so I was kind of in this middle area. And then the other thing about this piece was that you could walk between the two figures. There was a space about this big between them, so you could walk between them. And people did. And I wanted that to mirror this feeling that I had when people would ask me, "What are you?" by kind of separating my two halves. And I did it physically by cutting this person in half, and then they did it physically by walking between these two halves. And it was pretty interesting to look between the two panels from the front, because you would see this kind of mirror imaging, and that was curious. That there were actually two parts, but they looked like they just were the mirror of each other. And then this piece is called Served. And it's, I'm not going to get too much into it, but it's kind of about feeling like I was a token. And so on the table, so it's like a white table, and there's a white square plate, and in that plate is kind of the other half of her hair. I don't know if you can see. That was kind of taken off and put on the plate. I took the image underneath the table from Elizabeth Catlett. Like, I was looking at her imagery at the time. And then this is the last piece from that show called Connect. And one of my teachers in graduate school said, what's the weightiest thing about this identity thing? And if you want to talk about hair, why isn't hair bigger? And I said, okay, I'll make hair bigger. And so I made hair as big as the room would hold, basically. It's 16 feet wide, and as tall as the ceiling could go. And so I was curious about it after I made it a lot, because I felt like it was very vulnerable. The position is pretty vulnerable. And I thought about, and the hair is not connected to her. She's just putting her forehead on it. And so I was thinking about these connections that I could have with people, and how sometimes giving up power or privilege, or learning about my privilege could maybe be empowering, and allow for more connections rather than being scary. Now I'm putting my knowledge now onto this work. So at the time, I really wasn't as aware of what I was thinking about then. Does that make sense? So at the time, I was just like feeling like, oh, I want to connect to people, and this might, giving up this power might be a way to connect. So then I moved to Baltimore I went to Baltimore Clay Works, which is a clay art center there. And I had a fellowship there. And so at the end of that, I had to have a show in this giant space. It was a house. And I really wanted to have each room kind of be a part of my idea, which was about belonging. So I kind of moved my thinking into thinking about belonging. And my questions started changing, and I started thinking about the groups that I belong to and how they overlap and how they exclude each other. So where they kind of mix and where they don't. And so before Baltimore, I really had pretty limited experiences with people of color. And so things started happening to me there, and I started having experiences there that were so different than the ones I'd had here. Or in Nebraska. And so an example of that is that I was working in the back of a kitchen, and we were mopping at the end of the night, and this guy, who's a friend of mine, he just looked at me, he's like, "Hey, what are you mixed with?" And I thought, oh my goodness gracious, like, life has just started. Okay, so I went from this question, what are you, to what are you mixed with? It was like, you're part of us, how are we the same? You know, it was such a different kind of feeling than the what are you question. And so I made this piece as the entrance to the work. So everybody had to walk through this little tiny room. Well, it wasn't a tiny room, it was a big room, but a little space around her, so they could choose to either walk around her circle that she was making or walk through the circle. And most people chose to walk around the circle and not be in her circle, which I thought was really interesting, except for children who all ran through the circle, which I also thought was interesting. And their parents were like, no, 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 no. And so it's this curious thing, right? Like, it's art, so you're not supposed to go near it, you're not supposed to touch it, but it's also this person. And so I think that's a really great place to be working from. And clay is such a kind of tactile medium that we all kind of have some kind of experience with, working in, you know, playing in the dirt when we're kids or whatever. There's something about clay that has this physical resonance. And so, yeah, so then people were walking around. Anyway, I love this piece. It was very interesting to watch. And I was sort of watching. I went back into my watching mode, and I would watch people interact with this piece. Okay. This show was called Contours of Belonging. So I was thinking about the lines that we draw around our groups, where they combine, where they don't, and who gets included and who doesn't. And I was thinking also about my connections to people and how I maybe excluded some people from my circle that I could have had like a lifeline to, but I just didn't. I was missing out on a lot of relationships because I was scared. And then this piece is called Performance. So this is the three pieces from that one piece. Oh, I don't know how to talk about that. There's three parts to one piece called Performance. And I showed them in a dark room. And there was just a little bit of light kind of right as you entered in the doorway. And then you had to make a choice to walk into the room. And in the room, there were these three guys. They were pretty large. You can kind of see them, the scale. He's the smallest one there, the one that you see against the wall. So that's a figure. And then the guy behind him is a person, a real person. So here's the figure in the light, just so you can see him. So as you walked in, viewers would have to decide to walk from this white outline of almost like being on stage, but they would have to walk into the space where all of the people were, where there were these three large guys. And I tried to make them their posture somewhat maybe menacing, depending on who you are, but also their facial expressions I feel like they're pretty open. And so I was trying to get these two things. And the real interesting thing about this piece is that people would go in and then become they would become the leaner. So they would like lean behind the leaner, you know, or they'd go and stand next to the cowboy like this, or they'd kind of sit, you know, next to the big guy, this guy. And so I just thought that was just such an interesting way of them sort of moving from fear, because there was some people did not want to go in that room with those big guys. This guy was sitting right next to the exit door, so they had to walk by him to get out. They didn't really want to go in necessarily all the time, but they did. And so I was curious to watch what they did in that room. And then this was the last piece in that show, and these figures are kind of all clustered and clumped at the bottom, and they kind of spring out at the top into their own personhood. So I was thinking about, like, again, the contours of belonging, where we can belong, but also maybe not belong. And then I moved back to Olympia. And somebody a teacher in graduate school had said to me, you know, well, after you get over being biracial, what are you going to make work about? I mean, like, I had a woman who got raped, and she made a bunch of work about it, and then she got over it, and then she didn't know what to make. And I'm like, oh my gosh, right? So that happened to me in graduate school. And so I get back here, and even though that's so problematic, I think in my head, what if I made something universal? What would that look like? What would universal be? And so there were lots of things happening in my life at the time. I was getting married. I was thinking about having a baby. There was just a lot of stuff, and some people were sick in my life. And so I started thinking about change and control over the future, and thought maybe I can make universal work about fear of change. Yeah. And so this was the first one. And as I kind of went on, they became less and less about that, I think. I think they're both about that, but also they're about fear in general maybe, but this white blindfold, I think, is about fear of recognizing my privilege maybe. I'm still kind of working through these pieces to figure out how they integrate into my work, but after seeing them over and over with the other work, I feel like they are connected with the fear of privilege, or fear of recognizing the privilege. So in this piece, for example, she has the white blindfold on, and then she's trying to draw in her eyes. This one seems pretty direct. Okay. And then this one, I think this one is both about, I think it's about imagining, or fear that what you imagine isn't the reality, kind of. So I'm sort of imagining her, this is my narrative piece, right? I'm like, okay, this lady's walking, and this is the forest she's imagining, and then she walks through the door, and the forest she actually sees is not something we see, but it's out here, and it's not at all the reality. It is the reality, but it's not at all what she imagined the reality to be. I put this slide in just so that for art people who are learning about art history, you just never know when something might influence you. So pay attention. Okay. So I've been thinking about surface too. In those blindfold pieces, I was using paint. In the one on the log, I'd use actually a piece of cloth, and then in previous pieces in graduate school, I'd use clay, and they were all white on top. And so this piece kind of like gave me a spark, like, oh, I could add something actually physically on top rather than something I would have to paint on, or I don't know. This piece just kind of like made this little spark for me. Arneson is also a pretty big influence on me, and then also Basha Erland, she was here several years ago, and she encases some of her work in salt, and she does work about rivers and water. And so, I don't know, I think all of these things were percolating in my head. And so there's all these ideas, and then I heard on the radio this thing about these rats. So there's this rat, and they teach the rat how to do a maze, okay? And then the rat goes to sleep, and they've got these wires so they know which synapses are firing when the rat is running the maze. And in the dream, or while this rat is sleeping, the rat's head is running the same synapses, running the maze, okay? And then they put the rat again in two mazes the next day. So they had rat in maze A, rat in maze B, and then the rat went to sleep. And then the rat ran the two mazes, but they mixed together. They became a different maze, a third maze that was a combination of the first two. And I thought, holy mackerel, that's what I want to do in my work, too. I mean, that's what I do, right? I take all these weird things, plus my experiences with privilege and race and identity, and then I try to, like, mush it together. And so this, like, salt thing happened. One other thing that led to salt was I had read something somewhere about Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt. And so then like this image of a person encased in salt or being salt, anyway. So that's how the salt happened. People are like, where did the salt come from? Like, this giant story. Okay. And so here's the salt. I'm thinking about the salt not necessarily as actual privilege, but I'm thinking about it as like a residue that gets left over from privilege. So we all have experiences, we have experiences where we experience privilege or somebody else's privilege being used, where we don't have it. And I think that those experiences leave a residue behind that we then deal with. And those residues build up over time. And so, it's this that's making that noise. Whew. Okay. And so I was thinking about the salt as this residue of privilege on top of these brown bodies. So as I mentioned before, the brown clay is kind of referring to my brown body. And then I don't ever glaze the clay. I really like this raw, spotty clay. I feel like it kind of mimics how we're made up of all these different things, all these different experiences, and all these different elements that come together to make us who we are. I also love clay because it mirrors our psychological states. So it's very fragile, right? You can drop it on the floor and it breaks, but it's also so resilient that the clay objects that were made thousands and millions of years ago are still the ones that we find, right? So it's this kind of, I love that duality. So this is really recent work in the last year. I think some of us benefit from privilege and some of us strive despite privilege. And I think using the salt as a metaphor for that residue opened up a lot of things for me, ways that I could talk about it and examine my own privilege. I think that's a really important part of this work, is that I'm not only looking at times when other people have privilege and I don't, but I'm also looking at times when I have privilege and other people don't. And I make mistakes. And I make mistakes, I use my privilege, and I don't even think about it. And then afterwards I say, oh man, that was one of those times when, I shouldn't have said that, or that was really not okay thing for me to do. So this piece is kind of about that, like making a mistake and then trying to hold it all in, but sometimes it doesn't work. And also thinking about like where is the residues of privilege coming from? Are they on the outside only, or are they also coming from the inside? Are they internal? Are they internalized? So this one has like this funny thing, she's kind of spewing on her friend there, but there's something kind of not funny about that, and the other person's face is, she's making this face that I've seen so many times and I've made so many times, where it's like, really? Did you just say that? And then I also think that privilege is something that we can't really get rid of. So you still, even if you are conscious of your privilege, you still live with it. Other people give you things and do things for you because of your privilege that you are probably not aware of, or you get it anyway, even if you don't want it. So you can like pick up as many lenses as you want, but it's still there. You still see the world through your privilege. These two pieces, if you flip them, again, the backs of the boats against each other, their stances mirror each other. So it's getting sort of two sides of this coin that I go through, or that I experience. I was thinking about the internalized part of this. Internalized racism, it's internalized racism, really. Because that privilege gets piled up in there. or the residue, not the actual privilege, but the residue of the privilege. And sometimes the privilege. And this one, she's like licking this privilege off of her arm, or the residue of it. But then, what happens to that? So she's licking it off, but then it's going to go back into her body. She's going to re-ingest it. Maybe it'll come out the other end. Or maybe she sweats it out, and then it becomes more on the outside. Like it's hard to get rid of it. So I have some process slides. You guys want to see those? Okay. So Beth Cavendish-Dichter is one of my huge influences. She's so awesome. But she kind of figured out how to do this, working solid and clay. And so I do exactly what she does. We build these armatures, except she's much more meticulous. I'm kind of not meticulous. I'm kind of like, this will work. Most of the time it does. She has drawings on her computer, and she figures out, so meticulous. Not so much. But anyway, so this thing is giant, right? But it's solid clay. So she's got this series of armature parts on the inside. These are just pipes. These are black pipe that you can buy at the hardware store for pretty cheap. And we put them together, and it's really great because they can come apart. So you can reuse these. So you don't have to buy that much to start doing this. You can just get a board, get a couple of pipe fittings, and then slam clay on, and you can go. It's really great. And that's the part of clay I love, is just rah. And so, yeah. Another person that uses this is Tip Tolan. She came and spoke here, I think, last year. But she's a huge influence on me also. I worked with her. I was her TA at Penland a few years ago. And she's just phenomenal, amazing teacher and person. And her work is also quite amazing. This is clay, if you can believe that. And in person, it's even more uncanny how realistic they look. So when I'm starting, I make pictures of a person. So these are actual real people that my work's based on. And I take the pictures in the round. So this is just a few of the images. I have like 1 million, right, of Corey. And I take special pictures of parts that might be a little bit harder to get to or harder to see in those bigger pictures. And then I take especially extra face shots too. And then I make a maquette, which is there in the background. That's the maquette of a different piece. And then this is the armature for that piece. So I actually learned a lot by making that guy, because that guy fell on me, which was not fun. I learned that you have to put one out that hits the ground. Yeah, important. And then, so here's the maquette. There's the sculpture that's finished, but not hollow. So that's solid clay. And this is for scale. That's the cowboy. And you can see behind, and actually here, these are the supports that I learned about that I needed to add to make it so they don't fall over. That really helped a lot. And for really large pieces, like the group piece, I actually made a cage and had the center part hollow, because to make all that, that piece, I mean, it's giant. It would have weighed so much that I think, number one, I couldn't have afforded the clay. And number two, the floor may have given out. It was a lot. Because I think I used a ton of clay. And so that's a lot of clay. So I made the armature, which was just kind of this weird cage thing. And then I started packing clay all around it. And I really added on kind of a lot. I have one process influence person. I just love Lovis Corinth. I don't like him as a person. A lot of his other work is really horrible, but man, when I saw that piece, I was like, that is how I want to sculpt. That's me right there. Sculpting, not me laying there, but me sculpting, right? That's like how my hands want to move. Okay. Oh, I put a drawing in there. Look at that. So that's one of my drawings. You can kind of see a little bit of the same. And I do the same thing when I sculpt. I'm very like, push, pull, get the eraser out, or not in clay. With the clay, I'm like, get the knife out. Maybe people in my class have experienced that. I'm like, just cut it off. Who cares? You know, make a new one. Oh, that head's not right. Just chop it off. Like, and that's how I work with drawing too. I'm like, oh, that doesn't, you know, that part looks almost right. Let's erase all of it. You know. So here's that group again, kind of like in the process of getting more and more finished. There's me sitting on a little stool for scale. And then it's getting more and more refined, and then they start having heads. And then this is it finished in wet clay. You can see the armature here that I'm going to have to deal with. And then I cut it off the armature and hollow it all out, and then put it back together. So here's some pictures. This is from Beth Kavanagh-Stichter's website. But you can see, you can see how she cuts things apart. Now these are they're small pieces. So I cut that big piece into a lot of pieces. And this is the part of the guy sitting down. What's his name? The big guy. Yeah. So you can see his shorts because he doesn't fit in the kiln. He's too big. So I had to cut him into parts to even get him into the kiln. So his legs are separate and all that. And this is just hollowing out. This is part of his shorts. Hollowing takes forever. So that's another image of the one that was standing up with the circle. How complicated that armature was to hold all of that clay up. And there's her in the kiln. So I often have to make these supports to support like limbs or heads or parts of the body that were supported by the armature but then become not supported when I take the armature out. And the clay it won't hold itself. It's too brittle when it gets dry. And then we fire, and that takes forever too. It takes about 3 days. This is a gas kiln firing, and we stay overnight. That's my mom. She almost always comes before a show and helps me get the last of it done, because it's such a big production. And then this is what we did for the big guy to try to get him seated. So we used a car jack, and I had people working on we had to hook him up to the ceiling. We had to work out his surface because he turned out like this, and I was like, ugh, that's horrible. And so we figured out a surface, and that's was my assistant Jillian, and people were making the chair for me. It's crazy. This is kind of last minute stuff, and then there's the finished piece in the gallery. So here's some resources if you'd like. And that's it. Are there questions? Questions? Yeah.
Have you ever had one of your big pieces just completely fall over and break? And if so, how did you deal with that?
Emotionally? Oh. Well, that big guy was pretty... Let me go back to that really quick. He was pretty interesting. So when he came out, this on the other side, there's a hand that's touching the chair, and that no longer fit at all. And the way his waist was so large, even though I fired it the way I'd always done it, and they'd always stayed, he just didn't stay. He was too big. And so I had to do a lot of work. I think emotionally, I just got out the power tools and was like, let's chop his arm off, because it's not right. And that's what I did. So I haven't had anything totally fail in a long time, because I'm really careful. But things do fail, and as ceramic people, you always you make a little kiln god, and then you just kind of like give it away, because you can't do anything about it. Once you do all the things you can do, you can't really do anything else. So you just fire slow and hope. And then when they come out and they're messed up, you just fix them. So, yeah.
How did you apply the salt? How does that get done? How do you make it keep its form? How do you get it onto the
Yeah, so I make the piece in clay and I fire it and all that. And then I mix the salt with matte medium and then apply it. And then I apply, it's kind of a process, but I apply it with the medium first, and then it's kind of not shiny and sparkly like I want it. And so then I apply another layer while it's still wet. Yeah. And different grinds for different size pieces and parts. Like I don't want some big chunky stuff on the face, so I make a finer grind for the faces and that kind of thing. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So you cut it up and hollow it out in the kiln, but how do you like reassemble it so it's a flush surface after you take it out?
Epoxy. Yeah. And then I have tricks for making it look and be like nothing ever happened, basically. We call it, in ceramics, we call it cold temperature welding. Mm-hmm. Everybody does it, pretty much, yeah. Because if you want to make anything big, you can't. There's some people who have ginormous kilns, but most of us don't. Yeah. Yeah.
Some of your earlier pieces, the material is wax. I was wondering what you were using that wax for, and if that was actually part of your final piece.
Part of my work now, or? Oh, like if it had a significance?
Part of the process.
No, it was a surface. I mean, I guess, yeah, it was part of the surface process. I was just trying to experiment with different ways of dealing with the surface, and I liked the wax because it was really translucent, so you can like make layers, different layers of it, and there's this kind of had this kind of skin-like quality to it that I liked, and when you feel it, it feels really nice. But I've made some realizations about. That big hair in the gallery, that giant hair, that had wax on the surface. And when I tried to move that piece, it was really hot out. Yeah. So that piece doesn't exist anymore. But the hair doesn't exist anymore. The piece does, the figure does, but not the hair. So I have there's some really great things about wax, and then there's some harder things about wax. But I don't think it had too much to do with my content at the time. I was just trying to figure out surface stuff. Yep.
I noticed that most of the pieces, at least most of the women were nude, and I think all of the men were clothed.
Mm-hmm.
Is that sort of just subconscious or unintentional, or is that intentional?
Oh, it's probably intentional. That's a good question. There's not that many men, number one, right? In fact, I only started making people who weren't me when I got to Baltimore. And I was doing that because I really wanted to just make self-portraits that I could just use myself however I wanted, and I didn't have to think about what that would mean to someone else. I could just do it. And I was easy to like get pictures of. I'd be like, here's the camera. I'm going to do this and you do that. And, but in Baltimore, some things changed and I wanted to make some other people beside myself. And so I did ask people to model for me, these three guys, and actually a fourth guy too. I wanted them clothed in that particular piece in performance because I didn't really want it to be about, I didn't want to go that far of like nude men in a room. That's pushing it. That's like going past the point where I wanted to go. I really wanted them to still be accessible, and I feel like a nude man, at least for me, I'm like, okay, you can stay right over there, buddy. I'm going to stay over here. So I didn't want it to go that far. Yeah. Did you have a question too?
Yeah, I have two extra questions.
Okay.
One's really short. Have you ever seen anyone try to lick one of your salty
Yes.
That's my concern. And then the second one, when I was looking at your piece online, I really like the detachment creating physical representations of history and making history visible. And like in our culture, there's like very much this like meritocracy idea, and we try to disconnect from these things, these residues from the past. And yeah, that hair was so great. Like she had cut it off, but it still stayed like erect, and like history is still intact, even though we don't maybe not acknowledge that. I know I'm saying a lot. I'm almost done. But yeah, I love what you said about how our hair is history, and like to a certain extent it's a metaphor, but it's also so true. And then thinking about how like the built world around us is like in school we think of history as the past, these things that happened, but really like everything around us is what it is because of history. And so yeah, I see that with like the salt and the braid, very much like making what's invisible and making what is history visible. So I don't know if you could say anything more about that in your thought process, or if that was something, you know.
Do you want to write a paper about me? Because that's great.
And also if you have time, the differentiation between, residue of privilege and privilege.
Yeah.
I didn't totally get that.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of sticky. And I got asked the same question the last time I gave this talk. And I think the reason I want to make that distinction is because I think that the residues of privilege are from lots of different places. So, like, I might have a residue of something that happened to me when I was young, where I was in a hotel and they asked if my mom and I wanted separate bills when I was 8. Okay? Like that kind of thing. That's a residue that I carry, right? But I'm also, just a couple weeks ago, I used my privilege when I shouldn't have. I realized it afterwards. So I want to say it's the residue of privilege because it's more than one. It's not just white privilege that I'm talking about. It's more than one thing. So that's why I'm trying to, but it is white. So, and I am getting at that too. Yeah, I think it's both. More questions? Yes?
Another thought to what you were just discussing, thinking about the piece cleanse. You talked about how the figure can take it in, but where does it go? And just the question of metabolism and how it sort of strikes me, that part of what you're doing is you're metabolizing these questions, these issues, these experiences, these embedded, sort of structural violences. And, it doesn't go away, but you move it around and you work with it. And yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Move it around.
You don't let it sit there unexamined. And,
right.
And then art allows people who interact with it to kind of reflect,
Yeah.
We
That's
can't
what I
get
want to
rid
do.
of it. We have
Yeah,
to
we
work
can't get rid of
or
it.
we hope to, but
You
it's
can't,
there.
though.
So,
yeah, it's there. Always there. Exactly. I like that idea of metabolizing. I'm going to write that down. It's good. Any other questions, comments? Yeah.
In your piece reflection, or realization, I think it was, there was a boat.
Uh-huh.
And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that and what the implied water underneath it represents.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so the boat thing, the boat's like, I think of it as, so I went to this workshop, it was a journaling workshop it was a pro-golf journaling workshop, and in there's this thing about going down in our own well, and how each of us is like our own well, and so we dig down, but then underneath there's collective unconscious, okay? So I feel like we're all like in our boats. We all have this individual little boat that we're kind of navigating these oceans and seas with. And in some ways that we're really separated because of that boat, which is sort of sad. But Then the water, I liked the salt. That salt could dissolve in water, but that also, if this person was in like a body of water that was salt water, I thought, oh, the salt. I mean, this is my narrative thing. I was like, oh, the salt water would, start to like be on the outside of the boat, and I don't know. I think the boat is kind of like a journey idea. It has a lot of things, I think. What do you think? No, I'm kidding. I thought there was one more. Yeah.
First of all, thank you.
Yeah.
Just amazing. And I always appreciate someone talking about process, which it's challenging, I think, to have someone ask. I mean, I'm a poet, so like I don't see what I write about often. You know what I mean? Like I know I'm using an image and I know that, but I don't always know what the interpretation is, and people will then say, oh, well, I saw this and that, and I was like, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I didn't. So I just think it's really challenging to stand up and talk about that.
You're not talking about this kind of process. You're talking about the process and how I think.
Yeah. And so my question is this. So I also lived in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I was curious in terms of you talked a lot about the influences. And did that prairie landscape, like, I don't know how long you were there, but.
Does it influence me?
Yeah, did it take hold of you at all? I mean, do you have any sense of that? I'm just starting to have a sense of that. And it's been 15 years since I lived.
I went to undergrad at Grinnell, which is in Iowa, and then grad in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is also fairly flat. Iowa's a little more hilly, but a lot of prairie landscape. I don't know. I think place always has an influence on me. So, yeah, I think it does. I'm not sure that particular landscape has one on me at this point, but who knows? I think everything influences everything. So, down the line. Or maybe it will come out in some other part of my work. Yeah. Yep.
I'm wondering if you could talk about your teaching work a little bit.
Oh.
If you're teaching like mostly craft, or if you're also asking your students to dig into their identity as well.
I'm mostly teaching craft. Yep. Yeah. I think that there's kind of a lack of that in learning the actual like nuts and bolts of how to make something. In this kind of fast-paced, let's just slap it together to get the idea out there right now. Let's do the idea. I'm more of like the long haul kind of idea, that this is a time when you might be thinking about your ideas and what you want to say, but you're also trying to just learn the nuts and bolts of how to actually make something. It's like writing. You're still learning how to write. Even though your ideas are in there, they're still like you're figuring out how to talk about the ideas better. It's the same skill kind of thing that we do at least that I would like to do in ceramics. Yeah.
Maybe a tag on to that is, I'm really curious about the relationship between your concept and your craft in your process. I think that, especially the more installation type pieces, you require a lot of visioning and maybe diagramming ahead of time.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, with the way that you work with the clay, if you allow that to change
Yeah.
as you're working with it, and what does that look like?
Uh-huh.
And are there times where you feel like you actually change your original idea?
Yeah. Yeah, there are times when that happens. That piece in my graduate work with the big panels, that took a lot of figuring out what that was going to look like. And so I had like a maquette room that was the same size and shape of the room, only small. And then I made little figures and I would move them around to see how I wanted that space to feel. And then I had actually made a little person that was to scale, and I would take pictures from their perspective to see how it might feel when you walk in. But there was nothing like actually seeing that made that way. And I played a lot with the panels and how I was going to make what I wanted that to feel like, that experience to be like in that space. But yeah, I think I do. I think my process is pretty. I dig out all my figures. Like I'm taking out their insides over and over and over, and I reuse that clay over and over. So this clay has this like my energy, my insides, my feelings, my emotional landscape of that particular piece gets put into that clay. And clay already has its own life. It's alive. So those things go together. And yeah, of course, my process definitely is. I think that particular piece, black, white, brown, is like the most where it's visible. Because even that person is cut in half and hollowed out like I would hollow. All of my sculptures look like that on the inside. Every single one looks just as polished as that one does. It's just that one you can see. So, yeah. Yep.
Where are all your pieces now? They're all so big.
Yeah. Do you want to buy a sculpture? I've sold some of them. And then some of them live in my studio as like, hey, I'm still important. But some of them are still important that I'm still thinking about them, still trying to figure them out, or they have this thing that I haven't quite like figured out how to do again, or they have this thing that's like not resolved. I'm like, what is that thing that I'm trying to think about there and that one? So sometimes they stick around for that reason. There you are. And sometimes they just stick around because they're big and they don't fit in my storage unit, which I also have. Yeah. There's nowhere to put it. So you gotta like get it out so you can have room to make more stuff. Yeah, but I do make stuff. So maybe it'll be around in 10,000 years, I don't know. Are there more questions? Yeah.
You write a lot of grants, and do you have a favorite?
Grant?
Yeah.
Do you want to write grants? No, I don't write grants. I should though. I need to start writing grants because I don't have any money. But yeah, that would be a really good. Do you have a good grant? Okay. There's a lot of good ones. I've written lots of them, but I haven't gotten very many. So I just keep trying, and I write maybe 2 or 3 a year. Yeah. My favorite one? I don't know. The Virginian Groot's pretty awesome. I haven't gotten that one yet, but I will. Yeah. Back in the back.
Your work is fabulous.
Thank you.
Scale, and I love what you're addressing in your process. And I was wondering if Tip Poland had influenced you. A good friend of mine, I remember, which was really small and went big. When did you go large scale?
Well, the first question is, did Tip influence me? And absolutely, she's influenced both my work and my teaching. Yeah, she's so phenomenal. If you ever get a chance to work with her, do. But my scale, I think, changed because I was in Baltimore. And even though my studio space got drastically smaller than it was in graduate school, it was like the size of like this. I made all of those sculptures in this little tiny cube. But the scale changed because this place where I was going to be exhibiting was this old house. And I wanted each piece to have a room. And it was either like I had to make a lot of little pieces or I had to make not very many really big pieces. And I just went the really big route. And I felt like my content could be better addressed that way for that specific show.
And I wanted to make a comment. I saw your salt work at school here. Was that last year?
Yeah, I had a piece there last year. Yeah.
I fell in love with it, and I appreciate what your process is with that. But I was thinking about with climate change, it kind of started making this other meaning for me today, and that we are going to have salt at some point, and that with race and color and othering, that all bodies of water end up in the ocean. You know, when I sit up at my rivers, I'm like, we all end up in the same place. And I'm working on a death and dying piece right now. We usually end up in the dirt, or wherever. But I was just kind of thinking of that throughout the way you were talking about where we're heading with the climate.
Yeah, and then on another side of that is people say, well, what's going to happen to that salt? You know, is it going to, because our air is so moist, is it going to, it's like, it's an interesting, and so then if it starts to become liquid, like what, and then flows off the body, I don't know, it's interesting. Thank you. Yeah. More questions? Just waving, okay. Oh, yeah.
I just would like to know a little bit more on, like, you did a lot about yourself, but then you said that you had a few men that were, like, influenced on you. Like, what was their influence and their significance? And, like, was there a story behind that as to, like, what you were trying to portray?
The men in the performance piece? Those are just guys. They're specific types of guys that I wanted. So I looked for around. I asked people if they knew a guy who was really, really big. Like I really wanted a really, really big black guy. Do you know anybody like, you know? And they're like, oh yeah, I know this guy Corey. And I'm like, awesome. And then I talked to Corey, and Corey's awesome. You know, he's perfect. The perfect person for this very specific thing. Yeah. Same with the cowboy guy. And the leaner guy, actually. The leaner guy I worked with, he was a great guy too. But they're not like, even though I say I'm making specific people, they're not actually, I'm not trying to make Corey. Does that make sense? Yeah. More questions? Looks like no. Oh, you got one more?
Sort of.
Okay.
It was going to be a comment off there climate change.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting connection because, again, it's a metaphor and it's real. Like, when we think about the tides rising, who is going to be able to deal with that? The people in these developed nations who are emitting carbon.
Yep.
And the people who aren't emitting carbon are the ones who are going to deal with this self-resident.
Yep. Privilege, it's everywhere. Yeah. One more.
Yeah, you had mentioned where you had heard about salt on a person, and I was just thinking about this question back to me, what the water might represent to me.
Uh-huh.
And I think in a similar text, there was someone comparing themselves to living water.
Oh.
And I can see that.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I'm not a really very religious person, so I just happened to come across that, but that's an interesting connection. Thank you. Okay, that was the last question. Thanks.